Why don't we start with Amey and Vince?
Hi, good afternoon. Now, I'm Amey Victoria Adkins-Jones. I'm an assistant professor of theology and African diaspora studies. I am coming to you live from New Jersey. My biggest accomplishment at the moment is not my book baby, but my actual baby. I have a daughter, Judah, who is 8 months old. And so that has been a really interesting pandemic experience that maybe one day I won't, maybe I'll write about or be able to talk more about. But I'm really grateful to be here and to be in discussion and appreciate the invitation.
I feel an article for The Atlantic coming on. I could be wrong. So it's like, Vince?
Well, hello. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Vince Rougeau. I'm the Dean of the Law School here at BC. Also the new director of the BC Forum on Racial Justice in America. We are launching our first event tomorrow. We have a service of hope and reconciliation that will be live streamed from the chapel at the SDM. So I hope many of you will be able to join us. And we'll be having events throughout the month, including a panel next week that will include Professor Sean McGuffey, who has disappeared from his box, but and other faculty colleagues, and a Courageous Conversations event and a vigil event. So check out our website, and you should have gotten a copy of our newsletter as well. But it's great to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Vince, just one question. Since I'm doing the invocation, a call to worship, I'm supposed to show up at the SDM Chapel tomorrow?
I believe those of us who are participants need to be there physically. Yes, Mark. So,
I'm Mark
because
Massa.
it's a live stream, not a Zoom.
I'm Mark Massa. I'm director of the Boisi Center. Ruth?
I'm Ruth Langer. I am interim director of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning and professor in the theology department, teaching Judaism and comparative theology.
Great. Sean, do you want to go?
Sure. And sorry I had to leave. I have a new puppy who's very active and had to stop her from chewing on something she wasn't supposed to be chewing on. I am Sean McGuffey. I am Director of African Diaspora Studies and Associate Professor of Sociology.
Great. Whoever wants to go for it.
I'm Janet Kolodner. I'm a professor of the practice in the Lynch School. I don't know, I have general interest in these issues, and I'm also involved in educating the next generation of people who are designing learning experiences, learning technologies, and I want to learn everything I can so I can teach them to design with social justice in mind.
Cool, great. Marina?
Hi, I'm Marina McCoy. I am a professor in the philosophy department. I teach Pulse, including a unit on race and racism from both theological and philosophical perspectives. And just last year taught a new course on mass incarceration, looking at particularly race, gender, intersectionality, and immigration, which was kind of a lot to cover, but tried to do it. And I also have 2 adult children, one of who's a senior now, but who went through BC. And so I've heard a lot from them after they went to more diverse high schools about what it was like to come to BC. So I think that's a helpful perspective, hopefully.
Cool. Thanks, Maria. I always, when people ask me how BC is, I said, it's kind of J. Crew with crucifixes, you know, sort of much of a sameness.
Yeah, my children are white, but they said, my oldest, when they first arrived at BC, said it feels like a very white campus. And I thought that was significant coming from her. So.
Yeah. Jim? You're muted, Jim.
Thank you.
There we go.
Hi, I'm Jim Weiss. I'm the director of the Capstone program, the co-director of Cross Currents. I am in the theology department. I teach vocational, well, I also teach Pulse. My main field of inquiry is vocational discernment and its relationship to work and career. And I'm also an Episcopal priest, and I've served in inner city parishes.
Cool. Elizabeth?
Hello, my name is Elizabeth Shalala. I'm Assistant Dean and a Professor of the practice in the University Core Curriculum. I'm also a historian with an expertise in Islam and gender. So I'm very interested in this conversation today for a number of reasons. And I should say I have a sophomore who's a double eagle, who is a philosophy major and is pursuing an AADS minor right now. So these are conversations in our home pretty regularly.
Cool. Great. Wonderful. Kristen?
Hi, everyone. I'm Kristen Peterson. I'm an assistant professor in communication department, and my research and teaching relates to media, digital media in particular, and religious expression.
Great. Eric?
Hey, I'm Eric Owens. I teach in the theology department in the ethics area. I do religion and public life, a variety of contexts. I also direct the international studies program for undergraduates, majors and minors. And I'm a Boisi Center alumnus as well, having worked with Mark
hero, don't doubt it.
Having worked with Susie and Mark there for some time before moving over here to Connolly House. So it's great to be with you guys.
Great. Mike?
Hey everybody, I'm Mike Rougeau. I'm a professor in the communication department, like Chrissy. Most of my research and teaching is all about the media, political communication, journalism, advertising, things of that sort. And I'm delighted to be here. And I apologize, I'm sort of eating lunch too at the same time, so no offense or anything. I'll try not to be like gross. So anyway.
Great. Laura?
Hi, I'm Laura Steinberg. I'm the new executive director of the Schiller Institute for Integrated Science and Society. I'm here, I think, because I'm joining this conversation for a number of reasons. One of which is that I'm interested, as a new member of the BC community, I'm interested in understanding how BC and faculty and staff and students address these sorts of issues, and I want to be part of that conversation. And then the second thing is that the Institute, along with several other organizations on campus and with the Forum on Racial Justice, is sponsoring will be sponsoring a set of events related to environmental racism. And we're hoping that we expect the first event will be the first week of December. So stay tuned for that.
Great, wonderful. Kira?
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kira Malika Daniels. I'm an assistant professor in art history and African diaspora studies with a courtesy appointment in theology. My work centers on Central African and Caribbean healing traditions, sacred arts traditions, and I am deeply devoted to discussions of religious racism as well as racism. So delighted to be here and support our fellow AADS faculty members.
Great, wonderful. And last, and by certainly no means least, next to last, my good friend Eve Spangler.
Thank you. It's wonderful to see so many friends on the call. So I'm Eve Spangler. I'm in the sociology department, and I've been active. My first political activity as a very young adult in high school was participating as a kindergarten teacher in the Reverend Milton Galamison's school boycotts in New York City at Siloam Presbyterian Church, where he was the minister. And I peaked very early. My first 15 minutes of fame was reading to the kindergarten students a book about a fairy tale about little brown rabbits and little white rabbits who met each other, and then they were all little brown and white spotted rabbits living happily ever after. And I looked up and Malcolm X was standing in the doorway, and he just rolled his eyes at me and left. And so that was I peaked early. And now I'm doing work on human rights in the Israeli-Palestinian context, and I'm particularly interested in the way in which there is a relationship to the militarization of American policing and Israeli trainers. So that's an interest of mine.
And last, certainly by no means least, my boss, Susie Richard.
Hi, welcome everyone. I'm here. I'm the person who you received the emails from. So I'm delighted to see so many familiar friendly faces and new ones. Welcome.
Great. I thought I would organize this. We have till 1:15. If you're eating, please eat. I'm Italian, so that's completely above board. So that's always permitted. I thought we would start with Amey, Victoria, and Vince, and then open it up. Now, the questions I asked, I sent to Amey, Victoria, and to Vince were, to Amey, I said, everybody here has received a copy of Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail. And I thought Amey would open up by either talking about what she thought was relevant there or other resources that you find in the Black church experience that are relevant to the moment we live in, the moment of Black Lives Matter. So Amey, you can leap in wherever you want.
All right. Well, we'll see how I land. So thank you again for the invitation, for being here. I actually struggled when Mark asked me to provide a short reading, that sort of speaks to Black church context and that speaks to our contemporary context. Part of that is because the Black church tradition has, unfortunately, is often described, or like the Black church is often referred to in a very monolithic way that doesn't reflect the very different sort of theological nuances, even in as much as there are marked cultural practices and marked ways of engaging in a religious Christian space, particularly in the American context. And so even as I was rereading this and thinking about someone who is often seen as a kind of representative of Black church traditions and someone who, someone as ubiquitous as Martin Luther King, this letter I still teach it. I know many people teach it. It still resonates, unfortunately, on far too many levels, and far more levels than I am comfortable with. And it saddens me to reread it because it does not particularly feel like a letter that was written, 50, 60 years ago, 50 years ago, that it could be written from someone today. And that is deeply disappointing. And I share in Martin Luther King Jr.'s disappointment and sadness as he is expressing this letter when I continue to look around and see the news. And I wonder what world is my own child inheriting at this point in time. There's a few things that I want to point out from the letter to make a few other comments on. The first is a moment where King says that nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. When I think of how the Black Lives Matter protests were revived in the midst of this pandemic, were revived around George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, and even now to an extent, the continued lament around what has happened with Breonna Taylor's case, I wonder about the feeling of refusal to negotiate. I think that the current movement of Black Lives Matter is making some different claims about whether or not the systems that have often been thought about as needing reform actually need to be defunded or actually need to be abolished. If we need to think and imagine differently the kind of world that we want going forward, I think that the way that COVID-19 as a pandemic has exacerbated the social ills and particularly the racial injustices and disparities of our world has really hit home for some people in a particular and new kind of way. But when I think about that in relationship to the church, and when I think about that in relationship to Black churches and Black church traditions, particularly of Christian theological traditions, Martin Luther King Jr. expresses in this letter his disappointment with the church writ large. And I think that I resonate with that, particularly because he says, "But the judgment of God is upon the church as never before. If today's church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century. Every day I meet young people whose disappointment with the church is turned into outright disgust. Now, that's a very freighted and weighty comment, but we also can see, the President of the United States, waving a Bible, the way that theology has been used, churches refusing to close, churches refusing to, wear masks, churches refusing to protect each other for different reasons and for different causes, but with these particular kinds of claims of identity and how we think and understand who God is. So when thinking about, Mark asked, what are some of the resources? What are some of the ways that Black church traditions can speak to this moment? I've really been thinking and sitting and chewing on that a lot. One, because all Black churches, again, are not the same. And so not all Black churches and Black churches traditions were involved in the Civil Rights Movement project from the beginning. Unfortunately, there are aspects of what I would definitely name as white supremacy inherent to many of our theological ideas. Those things are, internalized racisms that can often be seen and manifest in Black worship spaces, just as much as they may be manifest in white spaces. And I think we have to be honest about that, particularly when Black churches and those who have promulgated themselves as leaders or representatives of the movement. Frequently, Black, male, cisgendered preachers have been very criticized, for wanting to speak or wanting to be involved in certain aspects of this movement. So I think we have to hold that tension together. But while our society is not one where, the Black church, quotes, is the center of the Black community in the ways that it has been imagined before, I do think that what is important about Black churches is that the Black community is still the center of Black churches, and seeking and thinking about resourcing those who have been left behind by social systems, thinking about resourcing and encouraging those, and sustaining the spirit to continue to do things like fight and protest, and to make claims to the fundamental dignity of Black people, the beauty of Black people, the goodness of Black people, has been a critical aspect of continuing resistance. So in terms of thinking about resources, I'm not sure, because I think that the Black church traditions have been birthed out of a radical commitment to survival and a radical and distinctive mode of resistance, of naming identity, of naming spaces that are not only safe, but that are sacred, and naming Blackness that are sacred. Blackness as a sacred project, Blackness as sacred existence, in a world that denigrates and denies that. And so in thinking about that, I think that the resource, or some of what's important about what the Black church offers, is holding people accountable to how we do or do not see one another. I don't think that, quote unquote, fighting racism has actually been the primary project of Black church traditions. I don't think that that has necessarily been the idea or the goal of the work. Now, that's an extension of it, and that's something that we do. But I think that there is something so powerful about naming and claiming space in relationship to God and in relationship to divinity that that has been able to speak for and sustain itself. The Black church has been a repository for folks who have undergone, severe modes of denigration in so many aspects and places in life. And it's been a place that resists that and says no. And so, yes, that can lead to different aspects of political and legal and social juridical change. But in terms of thinking theologically, in as much as Black church traditions have preached messages of liberation, I think that that radical sensibility around love and who we are and who God says we are, I think that one of the biggest resources is if other people could, if we could understand within a regime of white supremacy that this is a counter protest, a counter narrative, that joy as a form of resistance, it is one of the greatest offerings. Then I think that what that allows us potentially to do is, one, come together in some new ways around who we say that we want to be as a community, as varying communities, but particularly as Christians. It calls us to think about what it would look like to be accountable to one another for the ways that Christianity itself has been complicit and has supported and has really worked from colonial enterprise prior to that and onward to sustain white supremacy in some really problematic ways. And so to be able to say, wait a minute, we have to rethink this entire project.
Great. Thank you, Amey. Vince, everybody here has also received a copy of Cardinal O'Malley's letter on the sin of racism, which seemed to me pretty pedestrian, but actually evoked quite a bit of response from the Catholics of the Archdiocese, maybe not surprisingly. Do you want to talk about that or other resources in the Catholic tradition?
Sure. I think I have thoughts on both those things. First, to the letter, which was brief, but I think noteworthy in that Cardinal Sean made very clear sort of where the church stands on the issue of racism. It's pretty straightforward, that in Catholic tradition, racism is a sin. It's a grave sin. And I don't know if we hear that quite as often as we need to, but he says that. He also makes clear that he's willing to, position himself in solidarity with Black Lives Matter in terms of its thematic meaning. Obviously by saying Black Lives Matter, you're not necessarily embracing every aspect of what the organization promotes. And that's something I'm mentioning because it's an issue around how a lot of Christians and Catholics respond to Black Lives Matter, the words. So just put that there as with a coda. But he says it and he names it, and that's significant in this context. He mentions, I think he personalizes his own experience, by signaling the time he spent in Washington, D.C. In the late 1960s. And, I think that was also important in terms of humanizing the engagement that he is attempting to express with this moment. But it doesn't go far. It's not particularly deep. But I'll also note that it was meant to be read in all Catholic churches in the Archdiocese, but I don't think it was. So I certainly wasn't read in our church, I can tell you that. And a lot of people haven't heard this letter. And, it was left, I guess, to individual pastors to decide whether or not they were going to read it, during Mass, which, as Catholics understand, that when something like this comes from the Archbishop and is read during Mass, there's a certain power and a certain authority that is sent, to the congregation at that moment. And the fact that it sort of, seems like it was optional says something important as well. I think what we see in this letter is the kind of schizophrenic approach that Catholics have in this country in particular have long had around the issue of race and racism and racial justice within the church and outside of it. We see, I think, a lot of internal debate and dissension going on in American Catholicism right now that is tied deeply to political schisms within the American within American public life and American culture. And we see, I think, increasingly the extremely important benefit that many American Catholics have obtained from white supremacy. They've been very dependent on it as a form of, as a vehicle of assimilation. And there are many American Catholics, I think, who are deeply tied to it and afraid to let it go, even if it's at the cost of being in direct opposition to core tenets of Catholicism. And what many have done, unfortunately, in my mind, is they have seized upon an issue, abortion, and used it as a cudgel to beat back any kind of meaningful discussion about the responsibilities they have as Catholics in this society to address racism and racial justice and their own complicity in racism in this country. And so what they've done is they've, tried to seal themselves off from any kind of political debate and latch themselves on to, the Republican Party or a political moment in the country that sort of shuts down the conversation once you, try to move beyond breaking down now. But it has been a very effective strategy, a strategy that I think was tailored with Catholics in mind, in this country by the Republican Party, with their willing involvement, to build a political consensus on the right. So there's that. But
that's a big that, by the way.
But, and this is an important but, the Catholic community is extraordinarily diverse in this country, and particularly the extraordinary growth of Latino Catholicism in the United States. Not to mention the fact that there has always been a relatively small but fairly constant group of Black Catholics in the United States, and Asian Catholics. The division becomes very apparent when you start seeing how Black, Latino, and Asian Catholics respond to a lot of these issues, as opposed to white Catholics, who are pretty much split, in terms of how they identify politically and how they sort of engage the church around issues like racism and other sort of social justice issues. Let's put it that way, for the sake of convenience. And from my perspective, the big resource that Catholics have, and that some Catholics ignore, that make a pathway on these issues very clear, is the social justice, Catholic social teaching, excuse me. And I'm just really excited about Fratelli Tutti, the most recent encyclical that has just come out from Pope Francis, which talks in very plain language about our responsibilities to one another. And I think what's happened in the American Catholic Church is there are many, many American Catholics who have ignored or rejected or don't understand the communal and solidaristic nature of Catholicism, which flies directly in the face of American trends of, radical individualism and, this sort of fascination, almost worship of market liberalism. So the fact that the Catholic Church does not claim to, support in any meaningful way, the American capitalist model of the economy, nor does it at all support, the American obsession with individualism. And in fact, it rejects it rather clearly, twists a lot of American Catholics in a knot. And, the Pope has now, I think, put a really strong marker down on where we're supposed to be. And I think Fratelli Tutti and the rest of the Catholic social teaching can be a huge asset in helping us engage the question and issues of race that we're talking about, because it was going to require the kind of fraternity he talks about, the kind of sense of communal responsibility for current circumstances and for what has happened in the past, in as much as we as individuals have benefited from a racist past. Those of us in the white community who, do not want to see that must confront that. And, a lot of Americans have worked very hard to also shut that conversation down, this lack of responsibility or this claim that they have no responsibility for things that happened prior to their time in this world, which sounds very naive and very adolescent. And when you talk to people in other parts of the world, they find those arguments rather specious, but Americans use them all the time. And they have resonance here, but I don't think when you look at those kinds of arguments from the Catholic perspective, and when you look at the Catholic social teaching, that those arguments should be taken seriously anymore. So hopefully we're at a turning point, I believe, given everything that's been happening, where we can reframe the conversation in a way that really will allow us to talk about structural racism, community responsibility, our responsibilities to one another, and maybe move forward on these discussions of race and racial justice.
Just a brief comment to build on both what Amey and Vince said. The Boisi Center just finished 3 webinars on Catholics in the 2020 election, which had many hundreds of people Zoom in actually. But the second one was on Republicans, and we had Archbishop Tobin of Newark, who's at this point maybe the most powerful Catholic prelate in the United States. And somebody asked him, they had presentations, and like here, there was audience participation, there was community participation. And so he said, can a Catholic in good conscience vote for Joe Biden? And without a blinking, Cardinal Tobin said, well, this Catholic in good conscience is going to vote for Joe Biden. I have real questions whether a Catholic in good conscience can vote for the other person. Well, how should we put this? There was a lot of energy on our Twitter account right after that, because, in fact, as you say, it's the Catholic community is divided right down the middle. 65% of Anglo-Catholics voted for Trump. 80% of Hispanic Catholics voted for Hillary. So, I mean, the idea that there is a Catholic vote that's monolithic is very problematic, I think so. At this point, I want to have everybody jump in. So I sent out some questions about BC's role in this, or the ways that we might institutionalize addressing racism. But if you want to start by addressing anything that Amey and Vince talked about, go right ahead. So the floor is open. Sean, I've never known you to be silent in these kinds of things. It's like,
yeah, that's true. Well, a couple of responses. One, it's weird being on these Zooms where you have to mute yourself. There were so many times. I grew up in a Black Baptist church where you're supposed to actually respond back. There were so many times I wanted to say, you couldn't hear me, but I was saying amen as y'all were talking. So still trying to get used to having these sort of conversations, especially when we're talking about religion in these contexts. A couple of responses, like especially I was really feeling a lot what Amey was saying, with one little caveat, which I know you know, but we talked about this before, but like, but the whole liberation, Black liberation, is that in the church, that not all Blackness is celebrated and liberated. I'm Black and queer, and I've had my own struggles in the Black Baptist church. So I just think that little caveat has to be out there about how we are affirming different types of Blackness and how the church goes. But I really appreciate the multiplicity you were talking about, and the multiplicity of responses, and how that impacts these discussions. Because you're right, we do oftentimes gloss over these. And I really appreciate what Vincent was saying, because I'm not Catholic. I always joke that I had no idea what a Jesuit was until I came to BC. It just, the Catholics were all the same, these distinctions, I didn't get it. And so I really appreciate the whole idea of how, perhaps we're not using the social justice mission as well as we should. But getting back to BC, and particularly the way that, thinking about religion and its impact and the institutionalization of religion and social justice, I think we need to have part of those conversation that you were just saying about, there isn't a unitary voice or thought about, about these topics. Like, a lot of the Catholics, for instance, who are voting for Trump versus those who are voting for Biden probably have very different theological relationships to race and racism. And so how do we think about talking about those distinctions at BC, and how do we have, think about pedagogy, how do we have that emerge in a way that leads to social justice? Because I would argue that one theological tradition that follows Trump, in my opinion, is not about social justice, at least in the grounds of race, whereas a theological tradition that, although Biden has his own problems, I still think he's a white supremacist as well, but less white supremacist than the other white supremacist that's running for president. And so how do we infuse our discussions about how theology can work around social justice missions that lead to social justice? Because so oftentimes, and I've been in the room where this has happened with religious Catholic people, where we're talking about social justice and then religion is thrown in as a way to keep the status quo. And so how do we have these informed conversations that lead to justice and keeps justice at the center that is institutionalized? I don't know how to do that. I know that was a lot, but yeah, those are my thoughts right now.
Marina.
A million thoughts, but they might be a little bit scattered, so I apologize. I do think there are some good Christological resources, and I've been thinking a lot, both in my teaching, of doing things like James Cone and some more recent articles that I'll put in the chat box in a minute, that having our students, when they're in theology classes or other classes, understand the connection, see a Black Jesus is really important. I really, really think that's important, because I think there's a lot of work out there by people like Brian Massengale who have argued that, the Catholic Church is white supremacist and that it can't really envision Jesus as Black, and that Cone, wrote this stuff in the 1970s, early 70s to start with, and things haven't changed that significantly. There's an article I would love to paste in the chat about, the title is "I Can't Breathe Because God Can't Breathe." And I think when I've, made that connection with my students through mostly Cone's work, they find that very powerful, and that it's such a big reframe for our students is an important way that we can challenge them to rethink the structure of, what they've sort of appropriated as a very white theology growing up. The other thing I think that our institution can do is to think about protests very differently than we thought about it. When I reread the King article and he referenced needing a permit to protest, even though the lack of a permit would preserve segregation, I thought that's something our institution has also done, is by requiring a lot of bars to be jumped through for students to be able to protest. So, as a Pulse teacher, I'm trying to get my students to think about a systematic change and the ways we have to challenge systems and not just put Band-Aids on problems. But then those same students are potentially punished for doing that at BC. And so I think that's something for us to think about institutionally, is how do we make us more consistent in saying we really believe in systematic change and social justice, and that it's okay for us to be self-critical about our own practices.
Yeah, sure. Elizabeth.
So what's interesting, there's so many interesting things in this conversation, but I guess I would put although still relatively new to BC, the emphasis on Catholic Jesuit education, on Jesuit. And I would say we're very fortunate in this institution to have the long tradition of formation and practices of discernment and reflection that are just the sort of tools that students and faculty need right now to find our way out of this moment. And that's why the Jesuits are so often countercultural, right? Because of this system of formation that has lasted centuries. So anyway, I find hope and even joy in that tradition.
Well, I wasn't expecting that word, but that's good to hear. Sense of joy, that is. Jim, you institutionalized something important in the program you started many years ago. Any thoughts about how BC might institutionalize ways to combat racism as a Christian or Catholic or Jesuit school?
Sure. Well, I always wince when I hear some of the things we're doing described as Catholic and Jesuit, because a lot of the things that get lumped into that category are fundamentals of liberal education since the Renaissance. They're pursued by the great Lutheran colleges, by the great Wesleyan colleges. So I guess I'll make that my first statement, that we shouldn't rush to call things Jesuit and Catholic, which really have to do with fundamental Christian decency. And I think if we're going to say that these are, what I'm about to say might be controversial, and I apologize, except for Mark, and I'm not saying that because he's here, but except for Mark, I guess I would ask what Jesuit presence on campus has stood out for opposing issues of racism. That's a question. I could offer an answer. A couple of names come to mind, but has that really marked the Jesuit presence at Boston College? That's a question. And you can all answer it, according to your best lights. No Jesuit has taught in the Pulse program for 30 years. Just as an example of what I'm trying to get my hands around. Having said that, thank you. Your question was really about curriculum, which I think is not necessarily, there are elements of the curriculum which you could call Jesuit or Catholic. But on the whole, the curriculum is not really a Jesuit Catholic enterprise. It's a liberal arts enterprise. It could be called a Christian enterprise. Sorry for the long windup, but yes, I think if Boston College were serious about this, it would target certain key courses, core courses, where these issues are raised. It's really late in the day. If we're going to call ourselves Catholic, it's pretty late in the day to be offering a theology core if not every single theology professor is including this in their agenda. And that's really not asking too much. So that's one suggestion. I realize that's a very top-down solution, but we embrace top-down solutions around here all the time. And we're expected to go along with them. So I don't think it's very hard to start answering these questions. I think philosophy and theology, deserve their place in the core, and these are places where the question could and should be asked. We require that every theology course treat something of Catholic substance, and if as Vince said, social justice is fundamental to the Catholic tradition, and if racism is considered a sin by the highest authorities of the Catholic Church, then frankly, I don't think the answer is very difficult. I also think there are probably lots of opportunities in the new revised core where you have people coming together from different disciplines to cooperate. I think there could be a definite encouragement to incentivize people to create new courses where freshmen or to ask CTK if it would please make sure this is part of the wildly popular CTK and freshman seminars. So, to get everything I just talked about done should not take longer than a year. It will take 4, but that's how things work.
Welcome to Boston College, I would say. Yes, Eve.
Well, to follow on with potentially unwelcome or controversial ideas that will elicit a lot of Twitter traffic. Certainly historically I'm of Jewish background, but I think of myself largely as a secular humanist. But in this conversation, I'm thinking of myself mostly as a sociologist. And while I encourage every curricular innovation that would advance the conversation about racial justice among undergraduates, I don't think you build social justice on the youngest, most fleeting, and least powerful members of a community, right? And so to me, it's not particularly about curriculum. And I do think that in spite of the resilience and even worsening health disparities and income disparities among the races in this country, that students are already pretty much ahead of where older people are in terms of numbers who date interracially, who are not disturbed about a lot of things that disturb older people. So I, would be happy to see the conversation focus more on institutional responsibility than curriculum if we're going to talk about social justice struggles. And, I've long proposed to, I'm an intersections groupie, and I love all the intersections, all the formational programs. And I keep saying to Bert, Howell, what if we had faculty, staff, student working committees on issues of justice? Like, how do you bring environmental issues to the campus? Are we doing environmentally sustainable purchasing? Are we using local food projects? Are we sourcing paper from sustainable paper sources, sustainable fishery sources? Now, it would be an enormous burden to work on any project for staff and faculty to work with students, because student generations turn over in 4 years and you have to keep re-educating. It would be sort of a mission driven thing, but we could have so many sort of working committees on, how we draw students from around the world into the campus, on environmental issues, on sexuality issues, on class issues, on race issues. And I always get a pat on the head, like, you're a nice girl. Keep dreaming. But, I just want to raise the point that we're not going to achieve racial justice on the backs of undergraduates. There's going to have to be a whole different level of commitment in the university, which is not an argument against serving the undergraduates well. It's just saying they're not the people who need to carry this forward.
To reference Sean here, amen, amen. You say it, sister.
Thank you.
If you don't mind, I also want to hold that together, Eve, with something that I am constantly speaking to my students, is for them to know and acknowledge their power. They are actually power players in ways I am not compensated at the level of some of their tuitions. So they do have a press in such a way by not being employed at this institution, where there are certain ways that they, one, are hungry and thirsty and asking those questions of setting the world aflame in deep ways. We have this campus outside of BC's maybe, most immediate knowledge is known as a quote unquote protesting campus. Now, obviously, like, that can be explained, but when I came here, part of my job creation, the opportunity to come here came from protests on this campus that made demands for changes at the institutional level. So for me, it's important to hold together both that not only do I not, want institutional change can't be on the backs only of undergrads, obviously, and certainly not on the backs of what usually happens, which is undergrads who are already facing, Black students, students of color, folks who are already having to fight and work to have their presence here honored and recognized, but also being called upon to be the translators of experience. That happens at the faculty level too. I think that every AADS faculty person got an influx of requests to be present at everything, to generate talks. I got requests that didn't even ask me to do something. Like, could I think of something that could be helpful? And if I could take my time to come and give this uncompensated, lecture from all of my innate wisdom of having been a Black woman in the world. So those kinds of demands are certainly disproportionate. We want to resist those, further committees and further everything else, because so many faculty carry invisible burdens of representation, as do our students. And at the same time, they're the ones, I've had students who went and did an art installation, and, have put up Black faces and history, the histories of folks at BC and these different moments in ways that they have a certain kind of energy while being on campus that I also want to foster and nurture. That being said, yes, I will say that the theology core classes that I teach vary, my curricular choices are very, very different. My curricular commitments are very, very different from some of my colleagues. But I think that comes, one, not only from thinking about what we teach and how we teach it, but also conversations that need to be facilitated between faculty and administration together. I have experienced multiple racist encounters, and sometimes people have been aware of it and sometimes people have not. And so I know that has happened, directly for so many of us at different points in time. But if we are not able to, Anti-racism is a code word that is in the mouths of a lot of folks right now. A few years ago, it was intersectionality. I don't know what it was before that, but we have these themes that circulate around campus. Where are the places where we are sustaining and showing our commitments, including like our financial commitments for training, for continued conversations, and for continued work, and work that does not necessarily require folks who are already experiencing a minoritized existence or those kinds of conversations in a way that's increasing the burden. Because some students leave BC with a whole different, worldview and education than they came here with, which I think is part of the, Jesuit ideal. But some here do come here and leave, feeling more confirmed and maybe even more committed in certain ways to their own project of, privilege, self-sustenance, and the ways that, it is an inheritance of white supremacy, whether, someone would identify as a supremacist or racist or not, it doesn't matter, to participate in these systems in a way that continues to benefit them and that continues to make them, successful alum. And so I do think that there have to be some leadership resources on the issue to continue to see. I do see some potential for that with Dean Vincent over here. But, I do think it has to happen at multiple levels and with multiple interventions.
Kira, your head was shaking pretty vigorously there when she was speaking. Do you want to say anything?
Sure. I will first say that I am also part of the cluster hire that Amey Victoria was mentioning through AADS, and I was thinking a lot about that during this discussion, which is that we're looking, hopefully, if all goes well, to make more hires in AADS in the future, which is a very exciting prospect, right? Knock on all the wood. But unfortunately, it is once again in part because of student dissatisfaction, right? Once again, it is in part because the faculty realize that though our numbers of core faculty members have gone from 6 to 10 with our hire, that's nowhere near enough to serve the demands of the students. I am in the art history department as well, which is a very interesting place because that wasn't originally my training. So I've been getting an indoctrination, if you will, in art history. My classes look tremendously different from all of my colleagues. None of my colleagues have classes that have as many students who are not art historians as I do typically. And that makes for a very different makeup. It makes for a very exciting and dynamic set of conversations. But that means that I think some of my colleagues are having a harder time understanding the importance of what it would look like to decolonize our syllabus. And so this year we've worked as part of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee to think about what can we do to really decolonize art history and the field of fine arts together collaboratively with our students, among faculty members. And quite frankly, there's been a lot of resistance. To be entirely honest, I think a lot of my older colleagues have just not attended any of the meetings with these agendas and demonstrate a real lack of awareness of why this would be relevant to their students, because most of their students are affluent and white. And those who are not affluent and white are affluent and foreign students who are still affluent, right? And so I think that there's some real cause for concern regarding a resistance among even, some of the well-intentioned colleagues here at Boston College because of fear. And fear of what? I mean, fear of newness, fear of change, fear of accountability. I think that these are questions that we have to ask ourselves, because the reality is many of our colleagues did not come to Boston College because it is a Jesuit institution. And so we have to pose the question, well, if we are in fact at a Jesuit institution that is calling for, an agenda of social justice, that is calling for us to be, if not moral arbiters, at least facilitators of conversation for our students to understand the what is at stake in these questions of justice for people of color, for lower income communities, then I think that that's something that it behooves us as faculty members to pose that question of, why am I uncomfortable with this?
Janet, your hand up.
I want to go back to who was talking about formation. Was that Marina who mentioned formation? I want to go back to that. And I'm thinking and talking at the same time. I'm sorry. One of the goals, I mean, I think that one of the goals in education at Boston College, not only at Boston College, at other, you know, liberal institutions, is that people leave college changed in positive ways from the way that they got there. Okay, and it's not just learning in classes that leads to that. And it's not just, I mean, there are lots of other things. And one of them that's been mentioned is, you know, basically the culture of the place being a model for social justice and anti-racism. Okay, whatever that means. Okay, so that's one of the things that's been mentioned. I think that there's another thing that I'm thinking about, and I think it's going to have real relevance to Laura, and I don't know how many of the others of you it's going to have relevance to. Okay, and that is, you know, what's it mean to be a changed person? One of the things it means is to have new habits of thinking, new habits of mind, right? When you get in a situation, you think about things that you wouldn't have been thinking about before. Okay, and the question is, how do we help people learn to do that, right? And I think that the way you learn to do that is by being in situations where you must do that, reflecting on what you did and recognizing the value in it, and doing it over and over and over again. Now, why do I say that Laura is somebody who's going to agree with me on that? Because, you know, and feel like this, it's because the Schiller Institute is going to have some undergraduate and graduate programs in applied science and engineering that are going to be helping people not just learn content, but also learn how to be the thing that they're learning to be. Okay, and that's the way you learn to be the thing that you're going to be. Okay, and that's also what my master's program is. So I wonder, okay, I wonder how that could get integrated into the lives, I don't want to say the curriculum, into the lives of Boston College students. I know how it can get integrated into the lives of the students in my learning engineering program. I know how it can get integrated into the lives of applied science and engineering students, because in both of those situations, you're going to have students working on a variety of projects all the way through. Okay, and because Schiller's projects are, I mean, from what I understand about them, they're going to be learning about applying all of this stuff they're learning in the real world. Okay, you have to think about issues of human-centered design, human-centered problem solving as you're doing that. Okay, and if you're going to do human-centered design and problem solving right, then you've got to think about who are these humans who you're designing for. Okay, so I know how to do it. Okay, I can imagine how to do it. Okay, and how to make it come up organically and be part of the practice over years, right? So that people can be developing these habits. But I don't know how you do it outside of that.
Laura, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, thank you, Janet.
You need to talk.
I just wrote your name down.
Okay.
I hadn't met you before. You know, it's funny because you'd think it would be, the way you've talked about it, you'd think it would be sort of straightforward and easy, or the obvious thing to do, to have students.
I can imagine how to do
confront these. Yeah, right. To have students confront these issues in project-based learning and as they learn to be engineers or applied scientists. And yet we've been teaching this way for many of us have been teaching this way for 20 years in engineering, and we still haven't come to understand how to think about who is affected and in what ways and by what we're doing in technology, and how to put ourselves in the shoes, if you will, of those who we're working with and for. We've really been technologists more than anything else. And so I actually, and as much as we're going to say it's human-centered engineering, if you don't think about the differences between people, right? The different one, then it's just, they're all humans. Well, that's not true. So we have to sensitize, we have to understand how to do this. And the problem is that engineers don't know how to do this. Even the professors don't know how to do this. We haven't had these lived experiences. So I do think that it's going to be a challenge for us, and one that I want to make sure that we work on intensively and using all the resources we have in this call and others to build a curriculum in the engineering program that really fully faces these issues. And it'll be the most unique program in the United States if we do that. It'll be really special. I'll just tell you one quick story. I think I may have told this to Vince. So human-centered engineering, that's the title, right? Of the program where it's being created. And so I'm working with a group of Black faculty around the country, but there, you may not know this, or maybe you do, there are 2% of engineering faculty are Black in this country. 2%. And I happen to be a white person who's involved in a pre-proposal to NSF, where every other professor in this pre-proposal for a major center, a $40 million center, is a Black engineer in the academy. And I started to say something like, well, you know, we'd like to participate. We've got a new program we've created called Human-Centered Engineering. and there was an immediate outcry from almost every person on that Zoom call. Human for who? That doesn't mean us. Mm-hmm. So anyway, we have a lot of work to do ahead of us. But I think we have the clarion call to go forward in that way. Just so everybody knows here, however, I am not in charge of the engineering curriculum. I am the director of Schiller, but the engineering curriculum is actually out of the School of Arts and Sciences. So I work closely with them. We're aligned in terms of having the same goals and sharing some resources and being in the same building and collaborating closely together. But I have only an advisory role, shall I say.
So I just want to say that I wasn't saying it was easy. I was saying I could imagine it.
Understood.
Playing with it. And I can't imagine it outside. I don't know how to do it outside of that.
I just wanted to take the opportunity to say, even though that looks like the best possibility, it's really hard to achieve, and it hasn't ever been achieved that I know of in our field.
Yeah, Ruth?
I wanted to go back to something that Amey Victoria was pulling out, and also I think we had imagined this as a conversation that was going to be talking about religious resources specifically, so I want to bring us back that way a little bit too. And one of the, Amey said so many different things that jumped out, but one of the voices that I heard was this problem of small representation, meaning that when people like me need somebody to be able to listen to and learn from, the resources to go to are very small. So to integrate a discussion of racism into both my classes this semester, actually, I sort of put out a call to my colleagues in the theology department saying, what do I do? You know, I'm not going to be bringing people in because that makes an undue call on them, but even how do I get to the printed resources so that we can hear a voice that doesn't make a call on somebody? Or it could have been a video resource, something that's there already that gives my students something to listen to that will speak to their hearts and enable them to hear these mandates, which are coming from the institutional Catholic Church, from the Jesuits, et cetera, so that we can think about and talk about how do we recognize who we are. I'm teaching courses which are all dialogic. And so we're confronting this instability of the individual and challenging that in other dimensions all the time. And so bringing a question of race specifically into it is pretty natural. But how do we deal with this person, you know, with the reality of the people, and with respect for the limitations on the lives of the folks who we need to be listening to?
John?
Muted.
Sorry, I was muted. One thing, Ruth, I think you point a point is like videos. I mean, a lot of my courses that I deal with issues that aren't related, that deal with around issues of gender and sexuality. I instead of going to faculty who may have those issues, I go online and find video that be very helpful just to talk about those particular issues. I think that's one way that you can incorporate those different types of ideas, thoughts, and experience in your classroom, is going online, seeing what research is out there. There's probably an interview on every single topic you could possibly think of, and using those sort of clips. Like almost every class, I have some clip embedded into my teaching. And also, I think something else could be done too is, just a plug for AADS. We do a lot of programming, but we don't have a lot of people coming to our programming that aren't Black. I mean, basically, we have a lot of programming, but most people who come are either Black, and if they're not Black, they're usually a major or minor, even though they're not Black. So, one of the ways you could do is see the resources we have at BC, and send students that way, or and not just AADS. We got the other resources too that that can be looked at. Like we have all sorts of interdisciplinary programs to do with race. So I think there's other ways you can incorporate that. One is again looking for online resources, but also steering students to the resources that are on campus, such as AADS, such as Asian Studies, Islamic Studies. There's lots of resources and lots of programming. Unfortunately, though, the people who come to those programming are typically not white students or white faculty. It's typically students of color, faculty of color who are attending those, and or the majors and minors in those fields. So I just think that there are ways in which we can do this without overburdening the faculty of color by using the resources we hear more efficiently. But also, I think we need to make a very strong demand on the administration. We just need more faculty of color too. I think that's it. I think it's like a two. There's probably 3 or 4 other prongs as well, but that we work on getting more faculty of color here.
John, why do we always say we've been preaching to the choir since 1980? So, and I was worried about this faculty seminar, and I was astonished by the makeup of the seminar, because while there's a significant number of faculty of color, the majority are not. So it's kind of, so I took that to be a hopeful sign that there's a lot of other professors passionately concerned about this right now.
I just want to add a coda to what Sean said, is that we also need these things discipline specific, so that, if I'm teaching a theology core course, something that has nothing to do with theology then doesn't slot into that. So it becomes a little bit more complicated than just becoming part of the general discourse of the economic world or world of gender or what.
Well, I would push you to think about theology more broadly, or all these, because AADS is interdisciplinary. I mean, so, it could be, I could be speaking, Amey could be speaking, Kira could be speaking. And so I would push you to think about theology in expansive ways to see how these different topics can impact. Like we have our speaker next week is talking about gender-based violence in COVID-19. I'm sure there's some way theology can be part of that discussion. Issues of gender, issues of violence, issues of healing. So I think part of these discussions need to be, how do we take our disciplines and figure out ways that we can broaden them enough where they can encompass a lot of these social justice issues. I think theology can learn a lot from a discussion about gender-based violence in COVID. I mean, I just like engineering can learn a lot from that. I mean, there's different ways we can have these discussions. I think if we really stretch ourselves, I think ADS is a little easier for us because we've been doing this for so long, especially what the field does, is stretching ourselves to think about these dynamics in interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary ways.
We have 2 minutes, so I'm gonna do the conveners thing and take over at this point. I have 2 things. One, I would ask each of you, I've been trying to follow the chat. The chat's been very interesting, so I've been trying to go back and forth between the chat and sort of watching people on screen. Can I ask everyone to send to Susie, put up your hand, Suze, if you would, please. Send to Susie 1 or 2 things that you thought was most important. So some of it might be stuff that we talked about. Some of it struck me, some of the chat has been very important actually, giving ideas. What I'd like to do in the next week or 2 is to send to Vince, who's the El Jefe of this whole initiative on racism at BC, send him the result of our conversation. Just to have a sense of, okay, this is the record of, this is what the people, these are the folks who were part of the conversation, and this is what struck them as being the most important points that came out of this. So, and Vince, we will forward that to you. And our next conversation is being sponsored finally by Ruth Langer, and I wanted to give Ruth a minute or 2 to talk about what our next faculty meeting will be about. Ruth?
Yeah, so the next conversation, we've given it the title, Understanding Another's Experience, Narrative Empathy, Reconciliation, and Racism. And we'll have 2 panelists. One will be Teresa O'Keefe from the School of Theology and Ministry, whose focus is on religious education, youth ministry, and has done a lot of teaching and thinking in this area. And the other will be Rabbi Benjamin Samuels from Congregation Shari Tefillah in Newton, who is somebody who's been spending the last 20, 30 years thinking on this a little bit, but very much embedded within the Jewish community. And he will be sharing some resources from the Jewish perspective on how to make this an important conversation in a community that's been somewhat outside of the conversation.
And are you going to send us homework to read, Ruth?
There will be homework. I only have half of it in my desk yet. So.
Okay, great.
Yes.
I want to thank you all. I found this really enlivening and incredibly interesting and important. So thank you, especially to Amey, Victoria, and to Vince, but to all of you. As I always say at the Boisi Center, I only want people who are far too busy to be part of this, and you all fall under that category. So thank you, and I will see you next time. And remember to send to Suze your questions, or you can send it to me if you want. So stay well, be healthy, okay? We'll see you.